Now let's talk about tenons. Of course, just like with the mortise, you could use a saw, some chisels, and do this by hand. But for all the same reasons, I prefer power tool methods. Now my favorite methods all involve the use of the table saw. And many of these cuts could be accomplished on the bandsaw as well, but I find that the table saw produces a smoother, more accurate cut. The fastest way that I know to make a tenon is to use a dado blade. This is a special stack of blades that allow you to adjust to any size you need using these chippers and some magnetic shims. And just make sure the arbor of your table saw is long enough to accommodate the extra blades.
Switching to a dado blade is simple. I remove the zero clearance insert and remove the splitter. Next, I loosen the arbor nut using a piece of scrap to immobilize the blade. I assemble the dado blade with several chippers between the outer blades. The final width is about 1 inch. When tightening the arbor nut, I find that most people tighten way too much. I usually secure the blade with my fingers, put the wrench on the nut, and give the wrench a few taps with a piece of scrap wood. As soon as the blade feels like it's going to slip out of your hand, it's tight enough.
Now we've got our dado blade installed. Notice that I have to remove the splitter in this case, number one, because the insert that I use with my dado blade doesn't have a space for my splitter. And secondly, more importantly, we need to pass this over the blade without making a through cut, which would actually cause a major problem if we hit the splitter. After I mark the cut lines for my tenon, I like to set the fence up as a stop. Now this will allow me to batch out as many tenons as I need, and they'll all be exactly the same. Now there's a potential safety issue here though. If I use the fence as a stop, we could have a kickback when the workpiece is over the blade and wedged between the blade and the fence. And that's when I use my little handy auxiliary stop. It's shop made of 3 pieces of plywood and a couple of bolts. Now as long as the stop is in position before the blade, the workpiece will be properly indexed for each cut without the danger of being wedged between the blade and the fence.
Using my adjustable square, I mark the location of the tenon shoulder. I don't adjust the blade to the final height on the first shot. I like to do a few test cuts on the tip of the tenon. This way, if I go too far, I still have the rest of the tenon to correct the error. After a quick test fit, we can see that we need to remove quite a bit more material. Test fit number 2 shows that the tenon's just a bit too big. I raise the blade just a little bit and take another cut on both sides. Yeah, who's the man? With the fence adjusted and the blade set at the perfect height, it's time to cut the entire tenon. I usually cut the tenon in about 4 to 5 passes, and then flip it over and do the other side. Using the same methods as before, cut the sides of the tenon if necessary. And that, my friends, is a tight-fitting tenon. If the tenon fits too tight, a light touch with sandpaper usually does the trick. Although it doesn't do me any good now, a piece of scrap wood double-stick taped to the miter fence will help prevent tear out.
Now you could do this same operation with your standard blade. You just nibble away the material a little bit at a time. This is okay if you have 1 or 2 tenons to make, but if you got a whole bunch, it's a tedious process and the resulting cut's usually a little bit less than ideal. Now the next method requires the use of a special jig known as a tenoning jig. Now, you could pick up one of these for about $60. The basic idea here is to hold the workpiece in a perfectly vertical position while passing it safely over the blade. The resulting cut is extremely smooth and accurate, and with the micro adjustments here, you can easily dial in the perfect cut. Time for an equipment check. Tenoning jig. Check. Eye protection. Check. Piece of wood. Check. SpongeBob pencil. Check. That's how I roll.
After marking the location of the tenon shoulder, as well as the tenon's profile on the end grain, I adjust the fence to my pencil line. I then adjust the blade height just a hair under my other pencil line. I then cut a single kerf on both face sides of the board. I adjust the blade height one more time to cut the sides of the tenon. This time, I'll take repeated passes until all the material is removed. It's just easier to finalize this dimension right now. Before using the tenoning jig, I always make sure that the side and back stops are square. And using my kerf cuts as a guide, I adjust the blade height in preparation for the jig. While holding the workpiece tight against the back and side surfaces, I use the built-in clamp to secure the workpiece. I then use the jig's micro adjustment feature to make sure that the blade is about a 1/16 of an inch away from my pencil line. With the workpiece secure, we can make our cuts. Be sure to wave at the cutoff piece as it flies harmlessly past your right hip. After several rounds of cutting and test fitting, we now have the perfect tenon.
Now it may seem like I'm adding steps by not aiming for my pencil line on the first shot, but believe me, your work will be far more accurate if you use this relative dimensioning method. In fact, I use relative dimensioning on every project and for every type of joinery that I do. I'll go into more detail on relative dimensioning in a future episode. Now, everything we've done so far is a variation of what's known as an integral tenon, where the tenon is actually part of the workpiece. An alternative to this method is known as a loose tenon. It's a joinery method where you create a mortise in both workpieces and join them together with a separate piece of wood that serves as our tenon. It's kind of like a really strong biscuit. This is a perfectly viable option, and it actually can be just as strong as a standard mortise and tenon joint. One big advantage here is the fact that the tenon stock is going to be milled from one long piece of material, so it'll all be exactly the same and you can make a bunch of tenons in one shot. And if you use a router bit that's perfectly sized for a piece of plywood, you can cut all of your tenon stock from sheets of ply. Can't get any easier than that. Now, one big disadvantage is that it's difficult to create mortises in the ends of very long pieces, like table aprons. I'm ready! Now keep in mind that if your mortise has rounded ends like it will if you use the router, you might need to round over the corners of your tenon. You could do this with a chisel, a rasp, or even a sharp utility blade. Now sometimes you put the tenon into the mortise and you see that there's actually a little bit of a gap. You can't really get it to seat properly. So either your tenon's too long, which is an easy fix, you just trim it down, or you might need to relieve some of the material here on the shoulder, between the edge of the shoulder and where the shoulder meets the tenon. And what you want to really do is kind of, just with a chisel, create a little bit of a concave shape there, so that really the only thing touching the next workpiece where the mortise is this outside rim. It's not going to affect the strength of the joint because all the strength is in a long grain glue joint. So just make that concave and that should give you a perfect fit. Now there are faster ways to make a mortise and tenon joint, but most of these systems are out of the price range of most pros, let alone hobbyist woodworkers. Now the cheapest option that I can think of is the multi-router, which is essentially a horizontal router and a table that glides on ball bearings. You can easily batch out mortises left and right, but the tool goes for about $2,700. And until now, the closest thing to a lazy man's mortise and tenon was the biscuit. As we already discussed, the biscuit doesn't really penetrate deep enough to make it a really solid joint. So what if we had a biscuit joiner that can make a true mortise instead of just a tiny little slot? And what if our biscuits actually look like this instead of this? Well, Festool's new domino does just that. Now, basically it looks like a biscuit joiner, kind of acts like a biscuit joiner, but instead of a circular blade cutting a tiny slot, there's actually what looks sort of like a spiral router bit in here that actually, when you turn this thing on, will oscillate back and forth and create a nice slot that takes what they call their dominoes here. These are like the loose tenons, and they're actually made of hard wood and are just as strong as if you actually made the loose tenon with a router and then cut the stock separately. So let's take a few practice cuts and see what happens.
I start by marking the location of the mortise on both pieces like I would with a biscuit joiner. With the workpiece clamped down, I simply line up my arrow and plunge the domino into the workpiece. Nice. The second piece is cut exactly the same way.
Well, let's see what we got here. We cut both of the mortises with the domino. Obviously, that was very quick. Here's the little tiny domino that came with the kit. And that's a pretty darn tight fit. Check that out. And into the receiving mortise. Not sure you're going to find anything better than that. That's pretty awesome. Now the domino will be available in April, and if you make a lot of mortise and tenon joints, you really should take a look at it. And especially for a guy who makes a living cutting mortise and tenons, this tool is a very sound investment. Now after I finish this podcast, I'm going to start a mission-style desk with probably about 36 mortise and tenon joints. I think I'm going to give this guy a little workout, and I'll post on the blog and let you know how it goes. Now, if you want more information on a domino, you can check out the links in the write-up, or you can visit festoolusa.com. As always, thanks for watching the podcast. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to email us at thewoodswhisperer@gmail.com. And don't forget to visit the sponsored links. They like it when you do that. Check out the Wood Whisperer store for specially selected items that were featured in this episode. And don't forget to go see Martin over at lumberjocks.com. The man who started it all, Matt, over at mattsbasementworkshop.com. So in the meantime, relax, enjoy life, and buy more tools. It always makes me feel good.